There is a man who sits across from people on the worst day of their lives, and they tell him things they have never told anyone. They tell him about the bottle hidden in the toilet tank, the relapse they swore was the last one, the morning they woke up on a floor that was not their own and could not remember how they got there. And he listens without flinching, without that flicker of distance that the addicted learn to read in everyone they meet, the small recoil that says, "I am not like you." He does not recoil. They feel it instantly, the way an animal knows another animal. They feel that he is not above them, looking down with clipboard sympathy. He is beside them, in the same pit, holding a rope he climbed once himself. And the reason they trust him, the reason he can reach the ones the polished experts cannot, is the one thing he can never say out loud in a staff meeting. The wound that nearly killed him never fully closed, and if it ever did, he would lose them all. Carl Jung spent the last half of his life circling this exact paradox, and he gave it a name that has outlived almost everything else he wrote: the wounded healer. The idea, ancient long before he reached for it, that the one who can truly heal is not the one who stands clean and whole above the suffering, but the one who has been down in it, who still carries the mark of it, who treats from inside the same dark the patient is lost in. Jung did not learn this from a book. He learned it the way you learn anything that matters, which is by nearly being destroyed. By the end of this, you will understand why the people you most trust with your pain are almost never the ones who have it all together, why your own deepest wound may be the most valuable thing you own, and why the instinct to finally, completely heal it could be the very thing that empties your gift. You will learn what Jung went down into for 6 years, in a confrontation he genuinely feared was madness, and why he came back insisting it was the most important thing he ever did. But there is a part of this that is harder than the wound itself, a turn that almost no one is willing to make, and it is this: the pressure you feel to seem fully recovered, to present yourself as fixed, as past it, as someone who has crossed safely to the other side, is the exact pressure that will seal off the only door through which you were ever able to reach anyone. If this is already touching something in you, something you carry and have learned to hide, I'd ask you to do one small thing before we go deeper. Leave a comment about the wound you've quietly turned into the way you help others, even if you've never named it as a wound before. Not for sympathy, but because saying it changes how it sits in you. If this speaks to a place you don't usually let people see, let me know with a like. And if there's someone in your life who has been bleeding into the work of caring for everyone else, send this to them. It might be the first time they hear that the bleeding was never the failure. Let me tell you about the counselor. He is in his early 50s now, and he has been sober for 19 years, which in his world is something close to ancient. He runs groups at a treatment center, the ones that meet in the fluorescent room with the bad coffee and the circle of plastic chairs. And he has sat in that circle long enough to have watched hundreds of people come through it. Some he buried, most he lost track of. A few he saved, or rather a few saved themselves while he held the door. If you met him at a dinner party, you would find him warm, grounded, a little quiet, the kind of man whose calm seems to have been paid for. And it was. Because what almost no one at that dinner party knows is that for 9 years of his 30s, he was a different creature entirely, a man who lied to everyone who loved him, who drank himself into places he is still ashamed to describe, who once stood on a bridge at 4 in the morning doing the arithmetic of whether anyone would really miss him. He does not tell the dinner party that, but he tells the circle, carefully in pieces, when the moment calls for it. He tells the people in the plastic chairs the truth about where he has been, And here is the thing he noticed early, the thing that set the whole rest of his life in motion. The day he told a room full of strangers that he had stood on that bridge was the day they finally started telling him the truth back, not before. Before that, he was just another professional with a lanyard. After, he was one of them who had made it out, and that changed everything. His credential was not the degree on his wall. His credential was the scar. This is where Jung hands us the first piece of the map, and to find it we have to go back to the most extraordinary period of his own life, the years that the careful biographies used to tiptoe around because they did not know what to do with them. In 1913, Jung was at the height of everything a man is supposed to want. He had a thriving practice, an international reputation, a beautiful house on the lake, a family, and he had been the crown prince of the most important new movement in the mind sciences, the chosen heir of Sigmund Freud himself. And then he broke with Freud, a break that was not merely professional but felt, to Jung, like losing a father all over again. And the floor of his life simply gave way. What happened next he would later describe as a confrontation with the unconscious. But those calm clinical words conceal what it actually was, which was terror. He began to be flooded by images he could not control. He heard voices. He saw visions so vivid and so violent that he genuinely could not tell whether he was a researcher exploring the depths of the mind or a man losing it entirely. He saw a flood drowning Europe, an ocean of blood, mountains of corpses. He did not know in the moment that he was foreseeing the war that would come the following year. He only knew that the most successful man he knew, the man he was coming apart at the seams, and that every external marker of his sanity was telling him to stop, to look away, to medicate it, to bury it under work and routine and the respectable life he had built. He did the opposite entirely. And this is the decision the entire rest of his thought, and possibly the entire rest of modern depth psychology, rests upon. He decided to go down into it on purpose. He called it, in his own private language, the descent. He would sit in his study in the evenings and deliberately lower himself into the very states that were terrifying him, not to escape them, but to meet them, to let the images come and to speak to them and to write down what they said. The result, kept secret for decades and only published long after his death, was the strange and beautiful book he filled with his own paintings and calligraphy, the volume the world now knows as the Red Book. But the book is not the point. The point is the choice underneath it. When the wound opened, Jung refused to anesthetize it. He climbed inside. Now hold those two men side by side, because they are doing the same impossible thing across a century. The counselor in the plastic chair circle and the psychiatrist in the lakeside study, both at the summit of a respectable life, both handed a catastrophe that looked, from the outside, like nothing but breakdown. And both faced the same fork, the same one you will face, the same one you may be standing at right now. You can flee the wound, seal it, perform wholeness over the top of it, or you can go down. Jung's whole life became an argument that going down is the only road to anything real, and that the people who emerge from that descent carry something the untouched can never offer. He came to believe it so deeply that he built it into the very heart of how he understood healing itself. He wrote, in his blunt way, that only the wounded physician heals. And then he said the harder half of it, the part that should stop you cold. Only the wounded physician heals. And even he, in the end, cannot heal beyond the extent to which he has healed himself. This was not a stray remark for Jung. He built it into the very structure of how he believed healers should be made. He insisted that anyone who wanted to do this work on others had to first undergo it themselves, had to be taken down into their own depths and confront their own shadow before they were ever allowed to sit across from a suffering stranger. He had no patience for the clinician who treated the psyche like a machine to be repaired from a safe and clinical distance, who imagined that a wall of training could substitute for having been wounded. He had seen what that produced. The cold expert who knows everything about suffering and can reach no one who is actually inside it. To Jung, the healer's own ongoing self-examination was not optional preparation you completed once. It was the living condition of the work, the thing that had to stay alive the entire career, because the moment the healer stopped descending into himself, he lost the only instrument he had that could touch another person at the depth where real change happens. Read that twice, because it cuts in two directions at once. You cannot take anyone deeper than you yourself have gone. The counselor cannot lead a man out of a pit he himself never climbed down into. But also, he cannot heal beyond his own healing, which means the work on himself is never finished, never something he completes and sets down, but the very ground he stands on while reaching for the next person. His own ongoing descent is not separate from the help he gives. It is the source of it. Jung had a precise way of describing the engine that actually makes this work between two people, and it is one of the most useful and least understood ideas he ever produced. He observed that in any real meeting between a healer and a sufferer, something passes between them beneath the level of words, an unconscious current that runs both directions. He noticed that a doctor who has genuinely confronted his own darkness creates a kind of field in which the patient's own buried capacity for healing can finally activate. It is not that the healer fixes the sufferer from the outside, the way a mechanic fixes a car. It is that the healer, by having his own wound consciously present and open, awakens the healer that was always sleeping inside the sufferer, what I would call the contagion of the descent. The wounded one in the chair recognizes, beneath all language, that the person across from him has been where he is and survived, and that recognition is itself the medicine. It says, without a single word, the door out of this exists because someone is standing in it. There is a detail from Jung's descent that makes this engine almost frighteningly literal, and it is worth sitting with because it shows how far down he was willing to go. In the depths of those years, one of the figures who rose up to meet him was an old man with the wings of a kingfisher, whom he came to call Philemon. And Jung did not treat this figure as a symptom to be dismissed or a hallucination to be feared. He spoke to him. He walked the garden of his house in conversation with him, and he wrote down what the old man said, and over time he came to regard Philemon as something like an inner teacher, a source of insight that did not feel like it came from his own ego at all. Jung said the figure taught him the single most important thing he ever learned, that there are things in the psyche that we do not produce, that produce themselves and have their own life. He had gone down into what looked like madness and discovered, at the bottom, not chaos, but a kind of guide. The descent did not just wound him. It introduced him to a part of himself wiser than the part that had been running his life. And this is the deeper reason the wounded healer can heal. He has met, in his own dark, something the sufferer has not yet dared to look for, and he carries the memory of it like a lamp. Watch how this plays in the fluorescent room. A young woman, 26, 3 days clean, sits in the circle with her arms crossed so tightly they look bolted shut, and every professional who has ever tried to reach her has bounced off that armor like rain off glass. The the doctors with their pamphlets, the caseworkers with their resources. She has heard it all and trusts none of it, because every one of them spoke to her from the dry land of people who have never been swept out to sea. And then the counselor, almost offhand, tells the room about the bridge, about the arithmetic at 4 in the morning. He does not dramatize it. He just lays it on the table like a stone. And across the circle, the young woman's arms come loose, just slightly, just enough. And she looks at him for the first time as if he might actually be real, because he just told her the one thing she needed to know, which is that the bottom she is lying on is a place a person can get up from. Not in theory, in him. He is the proof, sitting in a folding chair, drinking the bad coffee. Now let me show you the other kind of healer, the one who got the same wound and made the opposite choice, because the contrast is where the whole truth lives. There was a man the counselor trained alongside years ago, brilliant, credentialed, a clinician with a wall of letters after his name, and a personal history every bit as dark as the counselor's own. He had been an addict too. But somewhere along the way he had decided that the way to be respectable was to bury it, to never let a client see the slightest crack, to stand on the dry shore as the expert who had it handled. In his groups he spoke beautifully about recovery, and the people in the chairs nodded, and not one of them ever changed, because they could feel, the way the addicted always can, that he was performing wholeness over a wound he had sealed in concrete. He had the knowledge. He had everything except the one thing that reaches people, which is the admission that he was still in some quiet place, one of them. The counselor watched that man have a relapse in his late 40s that nearly killed him, and he understood why. The wound you refuse to tend does not go quiet. It goes underground, and it waits, and the energy you spend holding the lid on is the exact energy you no longer have to keep yourself well. The sealed wound is not safer than the open one. It is only more deniable, right up until the day it isn't. To understand why the healer must carry the wound rather than erase it, you have to go back, as you almost always do, to where the wound was first carved, because the wounded healer is not usually a person who got unlucky once as an adult. The pattern runs deeper than that, and Jung understood that the deepest material in us is laid down early, in rooms we had no power to leave. Look at the counselor's childhood, and you find the shape of the whole rest of his life waiting there. He grew up the steady one in a house that was anything but, the child of a mother who drank and a father who vanished into work to avoid her. And from the time he was 7 or 8, he was the one who managed the weather. He learned to read his mother's footsteps on the stairs and know from the rhythm of them whether the night would be safe. He learned to soothe, to anticipate, to make himself useful to a wounded adult, because that was the only reliable way to earn a kind of love. He became, before he was 10, a tiny healer in a house full of pain. And here is the cruelty and the genius of it both. The very thing that wounded him is the very thing that trained him. The hypervigilance that came from never being able to relax, the deep attunement to other people's pain, the reflex to step toward the broken one rather than away, all of it was forged in a childhood that should never have asked it of him. He did not become a counselor despite his history. He became one because of it. The boy who managed his mother's despair grew into the man who could sit in a room with the most volatile, untrusting, broken people in the city and not be frightened, because he had been doing exactly this since before he could ride a bike. His professional gift and his original wound were never two things. They were one thing, looked at from two angles. But this is also where the trap is set. And it is a trap with two jaws, and most wounded healers eventually get caught in one or the other. Jung saw both because he watched it in his colleagues and felt it in himself. The first jaw is the one we have been building toward. It is the pressure to finally, fully heal, to graduate from the wound, to become the expert who has put all that messy personal history safely in the past. The world rewards this. The institutions reward it. There is a respectability in being the recovered one, the one who has crossed over, who now dispenses wisdom from the far shore. And the moment the healer steps onto that far shore and tells himself the crossing is complete, something quietly dies in him. He becomes one more dry land professional. He loses the field. The young woman with the bolted arms looks at him and feels, instantly, the recoil she has felt from everyone else because he is no longer in the water with her. He has climbed out and dried off and put on the lanyard, and from up there, no matter how kind his words, he can no longer reach her. The wound that healed completely took the medicine with it. The second jaw is the opposite danger, and it is just as fatal, and Jung was sharp about this one too. It is the healer who never tends the wound at all, who leaves it raw and open, and uses other people's pain to avoid his own. This is the counselor who is secretly still drowning, who keeps the rope in his hand not to pull others up, but because holding it is the only thing that keeps him from sinking, who needs the suffering of others the way he once needed the drink. Jung saw that the healing professions are full of these, the wounded ones who went into helping not from health, but from an unconscious bargain, treating in others what they cannot bear to face in themselves. They burn out. They cross lines. They feed on the very people they are meant to serve, because an unconscious wound does not heal anyone. It only spreads. Jung's word for the underlying error when we are gripped by something in us we have not made conscious was inflation, and the wounded healer who has not done his own descent is perpetually at risk of it, mistaking the patient's worship for his own wholeness. So there is a needle to thread here, and the threading of it is the entire art. The wound cannot be fully closed, or you lose the gift, and it cannot be left fully open, or it consumes you and everyone near you. What Jung pointed toward, and what the best of the wounded healers actually live, is a third thing, and I would call it the tended wound. Not healed, not raw, but held, consciously carried, kept clean and open just enough to remember, just enough to recognize the same dark in another person, but tended with enough ongoing care that it no longer governs you from below. The counselor does not pretend he never stood on the bridge, but he also does not still live on it. He visits it on purpose, the way Jung descended into his images on purpose, and he comes back each time with the mark fresh enough to be useful and contained enough to be safe. What actually makes that possible, what lets a wound stay open without bleeding a person dry, is something Jung spent years trying to name, and it is the most hopeful idea in all of his work. He noticed that when a person can hold two opposing forces at once without collapsing into either one, without fleeing the tension by picking a side, something new is generated between them, a third thing that neither pole could have produced alone. He called it the transcendent function. And the wounded healer lives inside exactly this tension every working day. On one side, the pull to be whole, fixed, finished, safe. On the other, the pull to stay raw and drowning. The healer who threads the needle is not choosing between them. He is holding both at once, the wound and the recovery, the patient and the survivor. And out of that held tension comes the capacity that neither alone could give, the ability to be both in the water and able to swim, both marked and standing. That is not a compromise between the two jaws of the trap. It is a third thing born from refusing to let go of either. The counselor is not half healed. He is something the language of healing does not have a clean word for. A man who has made an instrument out of his own unfinished recovery. You can watch him do it if you know what to look for. After the hardest groups, he has a practice he has never described to a supervisor because no form has a box for it. He drives home the long way along the river, and he lets himself remember, deliberately, fully, the worst night of his drinking, the one he never tells the circle. He does not push it away, and he does not drown in it. He holds it. The way Jung sat in his study and held the visions, the way you would hold something both precious and dangerous in your open hands. He lets it remind him exactly how it felt to be lost, so that tomorrow, when the next lost person walks in, the recognition will be real and not a memory of a memory. Then he parks the car, and he goes inside to his family, and he sets it down. This is the discipline no one teaches. The wound is not a thing he suffers. It is a thing he keeps, intentionally, the way a sailor keeps a chart of the rocks that once nearly sank him, not to relive the wreck, but to navigate other ships past it. This is where the story stops being about technique and becomes something closer to a way of standing in the world. Because the tended wound demands a kind of honesty that the culture around the healer is constantly trying to talk him out of. Every form on his desk wants him to be the expert. Every credential on his wall says authority, distance, mastery. And the deepest truth of his work runs in exactly the opposite direction, toward shared brokenness, toward the dangerous admission that he is not above the people he serves, but among them. The counselor has to resist, every single day, the gravitational pull toward becoming the polished professional, because that pull is the seductive jaw of the first trap dressed up as growth. The institution mistakes his refusal to fully recover for a lack of progress. Jung would have recognized it as the only thing keeping him real. There is a fee for this that no one warns the wounded healer about, and the counselor pays it in private. To keep the wound tended, he has to keep feeling it. He cannot have the comfort of declaring himself finished, the rest that the rest of the world gets to take when they decide a hard chapter is closed. There are nights, after a group where someone described a relapse in detail he knows from the inside, when the old craving stirs in him like an animal turning over in its sleep, and he has to sit with it, alone, and let it move through him without acting on it, exactly the way Jung had to sit with the visions that frightened him and let them speak without being swept away. The healer's wound is not a museum piece behind glass. It is a living thing he has agreed to keep alive, and the cost of his gift is that he never gets to put it fully down. Most people get to leave their worst chapter behind them. He carries his into work every morning, on purpose, because it is the only thing in the room that the suffering will believe. And here is where this stops being about counselors and addicts and becomes about you, because you do not have to work in a treatment center to be a wounded healer. You are one already in some quiet corner of your life, and you have probably been taught 3 lies about it that I want to name so you can stop believing them. The first lie is that you must be fully recovered before you are allowed to help anyone, that you have to fix yourself completely first, get all the way well, and only then step forward, which means in practice that you never step forward at all because the full recovery never arrives and the waiting becomes the hiding. The second lie is that your wound makes you less credible, that the broken places in your history disqualify you from speaking, when in truth they are the only thing that gives your words weight to the people who are still in it. And the third lie, the cruelest one, is that the goal is to get to a place where the wound no longer touches you, where you have transcended it, where it can no longer reach you on a bad night, when the actual goal is to be able to feel it on purpose and not be ruled by it. Every one of those 3 lies pushes you toward the same place: the dry shore, the sealed wound, the performance of a wholeness that quietly cuts you off from everyone you might have reached. The wounded healer does not believe the lies. He stays close enough to his own dark to remember the way out of it, because someone, somewhere, is about to need exactly that. And yet, and this is the turn that redeems the whole grim arithmetic, what he gets in return is meaning of a density that the unwounded almost never touch. Jung came back from his 6-year descent, not broken, but somehow more solid, as if he had gone down into the dark and found, at the very bottom of it, the bedrock he would build the rest of his life on. He said that everything he created afterward, the entire body of work that would shape how millions of people understand their own minds, came out of those years, that the rest of his life was spent unpacking what he had found in the descent. The wound, faced and tended rather than fled, did not just heal him, it became the source, and the counselor, in his far smaller and quieter way, lives the same astonishing fact. The worst thing that ever happened to him became the thing that gives his days their weight. The 9 years he spent destroying himself are now the 9 years he spends saving others. The bridge he nearly died on became the exact place he stands to throw the rope. Let me show you the young woman again, 2 years on, because the arc is not complete without her. She is clean now, steadily, the way it only sticks when it sticks from the inside. And she has started, recently, to sit with newcomers herself, to tell her own story to the ones with the bolted arms. And she has discovered the strange thing the counselor discovered before her, that her worst days are now her most useful possession, that the very wound she once tried to drink into silence is the only language that reaches the next person in the chair. The contagion of the descent has passed from him to her, and it will pass from her to someone else. And this, Jung understood, is how the deepest healing actually moves through the world, not from the unscarred experts at the top, handing wisdom down, from one wounded person to the next, each one holding the rope a little longer than they needed to, because someone once held it for them. You came in here trusting the man across the desk who never recoiled, and now you know why he could not afford to. You know that the rope he held was one he climbed himself, that the scar on his hands was his only real credential, and that the wound he refused to fully close was never a sign that he had failed to heal. It was the door. The door it has to stay slightly open for anyone to come through. So I will not tell you that your wound was a gift, because that would be a lie. The same convenient lie the world keeps trying to sell to people who have suffered. The thing that hurt you was not good. It should not have happened. Whatever carved that mark into you took something real, and no later meaning erases the theft. But I will tell you this, which is truer and harder. You do not have to be grateful for the wound to discover that it has made you into the only person who can reach certain people. You do not have to pretend it was a blessing to carry it consciously, to keep it clean, to let it become, in your hands, a kind of medicine. Jung's whole life was the proof that the descent you most fear may be the one place your real work has always lived, and that the people waiting for you on the other side of your honesty cannot be reached by anyone who has not gone down where you have been. We are not healed by the ones who were never hurt. We are healed by those who went down into the same dark we are lost in, and came back, not unmarked, but carrying a map drawn in their own blood. If you are still down there, still bleeding, still certain that your brokenness disqualifies you, understand that it may be the exact thing that one day qualifies you to reach the one person no one else can. Your map is still being drawn. The wound is still teaching your hands. And somewhere there is a person in a folding chair, arms bolted shut, who is waiting for someone who has been exactly where they are to walk in and prove that the bottom is a place you can rise from. If this reached something in you, write it in the comments, not as a confession, but as a line you are choosing to hold. My wound is becoming my medicine. And if you want to go further into the descent that started all of this, into the figure who waits inside you with the answers your anxious mind keeps overruling, stay with me for what comes next in this series, where we turn to the stranger who has been waiting your whole life. Thanks for watching. See you in the next dimension.